I think there are too few visions of the future. I think of Mark Andreessen in some ways as more of my counterpart.
Yes.
And
that's what I think
the
is an
person I am
interesting,
sparring with a little bit more.
Right. And so what I see kind of emerging among people who feel very dedicated to left-wing values is a kind of Malthusianism, anti-humanism.
This rapidity of the rise of BLM, of the Me Too movement, to some degree of then the alt-right and the new right backlash to that. I think there's a dynamic where things rise very, very fast.
I was surprised in the conclusion that you're making reference to Marx and Engels.
I remember a couple years ago when all of a sudden we were talking about tankies. And it was like, are we really going to take this seriously? And in the end, I think you don't have to take it that seriously. But they were out there, right? And they would have gotten zero attention.
They're still out there.
Before that, you would know for your sins.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Ezra Klein, an author, journalist, and political commentator. He is an opinion columnist at the New York Times and the host of the Ezra Klein Show. He is a co-author, along with Derek Thompson, of a new book titled Abundance.
Republicans, for a long time online, have liked to accuse other people of being NPCs, non-player characters. I have never seen a crew of NPCs like Republicans in Congress right now. They are just like the little figures walking around in the background of Grand Theft Auto. They don't exist. And like, I've met these people. They have views, they have ideas, they have egos. But when Trump says you're voting for RFK Jr., I mean, can you fucking imagine being a hardcore pro-life Republican? You fought your way up through politics. You made money, or you won early elections, and then you got elected to the House, then you won a competitive primary. Now you're a senator and you have a particular expertise in public health issues. And then Donald Trump comes in and he's like, you're voting for RFK Jr. now. You hate Kennedys, right? Aside from everything else. And you're just going to do it. And meanwhile, you're RFK Jr. and you're up there and you're saying it's all maha and make America healthy again.
Yep.
And like the real danger is seed oils. And he makes a seed oil lobbyist head of the Department of Agriculture. There is no break point. That is not the structure of this movement. There is nowhere he can go that they won't follow.
Sure. Yeah.
Like the only power comes from being in his gaze. And the only people there are the ones now who are willing to work with power that way.
We live in an age without much political optimism. There's few proposals for a positive future. What is a politics of abundance?
First and foremost, I think an effort to refocus American liberalism around a different question. I think American liberalism for a very long time has had the question, what can we subsidize? So you look around and you see health insurance is expensive. Maybe we can help people afford it. That's Obamacare. You look around and you see college is expensive. Maybe we can help people afford it. So you have student loans, right? You can kind of go down that way. Housing, vouchers for, rental costs. SNAP helps people afford food. That's great. I spent a lot of my career working on trying to get healthcare expanded. The problem, if you look in the places liberals govern, is that there is not enough of the things we want to subsidize. So you can give people in San Francisco, or for that matter, New York City, housing vouchers, but there aren't enough homes. So that'll just drive the price of housing up. You can give people student loan subsidies, but if there are not, frankly, enough colleges and they're not being governed well, then they'll just pocket the money and raise tuition. We can talk all we want about climate change, but if there is not enough clean energy, we're not going to get to the other side of it. You can pour money into high-speed rail, but if we're not building things effectively, you're never going to get it. And then there's this question not of the things we know how to build and don't build enough of, but the things we don't yet know how to build, but we need. So a lot of people suffer from really terrible autoimmune conditions. We don't really have answers to them. But if we did, then health insurance would be worth a lot more, right? Ozempic has changed the worth of what people get out of having health insurance. If you look at decarbonization, right? We don't have green cement, at least not in an affordable way. So cement, if you made it into a country, would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases on Earth. Until we figure out a way to do green cement, green jet fuel, things like that, we don't really have an answer on decarbonization.
Right.
So we both need to be able to solve things through supply. That partially means being able to build things we know how to build, like homes and solar panels, and partially means being able to invent things we don't yet have, like green cement and different kinds of cures. And abundance is an effort to kind of focus liberalism back on that question of how do we create the splendor of the future that we were once promised and once believed we would have.
You mentioned in the book Fully Automated Luxury Communism by Aaron Bastani.
A book I like very much.
Very near and dear to my heart. Nick Zernick, someone I've had on the podcast in the past, him and Alex Williams are the authors of Inventing the Future.
Yep.
Similar genre of a kind of productive, promethean, techno-optimistic vision of the future. Supply-side economics is often something we hear from Republicans and conservatives. Your refocusing of liberalism, are you moving it towards the center or towards the left, or how do you understand this?
I don't really think it tracks that well. I mean, I guess in my debates with some of my lefty friends, I think I am to their left in the sense that I want to unshackle government to accomplish the things that it promises it is going to accomplish. I think part of why we have a rising populist right around the world, and specifically in America, is that government doesn't deliver that well.
Right.
And when it doesn't deliver that well year after year and decade after decade, when it's sclerotic, when it's process obsessed, when it keeps making promises it doesn't make good on, eventually people begin to turn to figures who say, well, I'm going to make it work. I'm going to make it work because I'm going to blow through the rules. I'm going to bust through the walls. I'm going to not respect all these strictures that are keeping everybody else tied up in knots. So I sometimes have debates with people who think they are to my left and I think that I am to theirs, but I find that pretty esoteric. I think that I am trying to reorient things a little bit more in a Promethean direction, to use a term you used a minute ago.
Yeah.
When you said that those people it's a techno-optimistic way of looking at the world, I don't think it is. Because I can't speak for them, but having read them and speaking for myself, I think there's a pretty good recognition that the same technologies we're talking about can be accelerators of want, of inequality, of tyranny.
Yes.
If not embedded in good institutions and good policies. AI can be a lot of fucking things.
Right.
But to say that technology is at the center of social change is just to admit reality. And I feel this is a very under-admitted point, that we could not have the politics we have on climate change right now if not for the collapse in the pricing of battery power, battery storage, of solar power, of wind power, right? If you don't change technology, you actually very often can't change politics. A different way of thinking about it is that on their way out the door, the Biden administration put out a ruling saying that, in fact, Medicaid and Medicare, which have been barred from covering weight loss drugs, actually should cover Ozempic or Wegovy, et cetera.
Right.
And they should, because obesity is a disease. It's not just a weight loss drug. Fine. At current pricing, that would bankrupt the entire federal government. Right. We simply can't afford how many people would obviously qualify for that.
Yeah.
So right there, you see a way in which, as technology changes, policy is going to have to think through something, figure something out. I think a lot is like that. I think that I have a line in the introduction that, we should aspire to more than parceling out the present. But it's not just that we should aspire to it, we should accept that we are going to have to figure it out. We are going to have to do it. The things don't stay the same, they change. And so thinking about both what are the failures of liberalism, right? I come from California, and when I look around at a state I love, I think it is fundamentally failing because it is failed on supply. And when I look forward to the future, a lot of the problems that people like me want to solve need parts of the future pulled into the present if we're going to solve them. So I've heard it described as moving it to the right. I've heard it described as moving to the left. I sort of think of it more as a reorientation. My first book was called Why We're Polarized. It was about polarization. And one of the arguments of that book is that it really depends what we are polarized about. You can have healthier and less healthy cleavages cut into your politics. I think it would be healthier to be arguing about how to increase supply and weather, I guess, how to accelerate invention than some of the things we currently argue about. So
couldn't be worse than right now.
You know what? It could always be worse.
That's very true. You mentioned before in the introduction to the book, I think of your work, having followed your writing and reporting for many years, you're a policy expert. But the introduction to your book is a piece of short science fiction that lays out a vision for the world in 2050. Would you summarize that vision of this optimistic future?
It's I would call it in the terms of some of my nerdier San Francisco friends, an intuition pump, right? I think there are too few visions of the future. I think people don't like to talk that much about the future because to speak optimistically about it makes you seem naive, and to speak pessimistically makes you seem like a doomer. And maybe even as I say that, it's actually not true that people don't like to talk about the future. In the doomer sense, they do. The right has become very apocalyptic between the concern about fertility rates, the belief that we have so completely deformed the culture that we're going to have a civilizational collapse of virtue. When I read the Claremont Review...
See, that's interesting because I think of Mark Andreessen. He's the author of the Techno-Optimist Manifesto. So
yeah,
there's
but he's a new transplant to the right.
Yeah.
He's coming in... I think of Mark Andreessen in some ways as more of my counterpart.
Yes.
And
that's what
the person I am sparring with a little bit more.
Right.
Mark and I
that territory.
have, I think, a similar view. The technology's at the center of politics, and that you have to debate. And Mark has a much more accelerationist view of what that means. And I think Mark's view would lead to a series of calamities that would lead to a lot of technologies being taken off the table in the way that nuclear was largely taken off the table because when things went badly, people got terrified. But Mark does not represent what the modern right is like. Mark popped onto the Republican and highly political scene in the last couple of months.
Sure.
If the right were more like him, I would probably feel somewhat better about it, though he probably also has weirder ideas now lurking in the background, as a lot of them do, than the techno-optimistic manifesto. But when I think of the people who actually hold power in that coalition and have been feeding it ideas, it's extremely focused on collapse. And I think there's a certain amount of ambient discourse power to small is beautiful economics and environmentalism that is in a lot of tension with building fast environmentalism. I have this joke. It's not really a joke. I think it's actually not a terrible coinage, but I talk about the difference between green and gray environmentalism. That there's a kind of environmentalism that feels like the truly environmental way to live is to live in a beautiful glass house at the top of a large hill, surrounded by trees in Marin. And that both aesthetic and soul level connection with the land around you, like that's what it means to live a harmonious life. And I want to be really clear that if I could choose any way to live at all, I would live in a beautiful glass house at the top of a hill in Marin. Like I would be so happy. I'd have a jacuzzi, it'd be amazing. You want to know who does not use a lot of energy? People who live in big gray boxes. Right. Like this place, this concrete jungle is extraordinarily carbon efficient. I live in a 5-story, not my house is 5, I'm on one of the stories of a 5-story, apartment building. And it is much more energy efficient than the duplex I lived in when I lived in the Bay Area. And so I do think there is this kind of green-gray environmentalist tension between what feels like it is harmonious with nature and what is harmonious with nature. One of the reasons that the cover of that book looks the way it does, where you see big gray towers on one side and rewilding on the other, is it's an admission of that actually what you want to do is compress where human beings live. It's not hard to build up. And if we did that and we didn't use so much land for livestock, we could actually leave a lot more land to the natural world. But if you want to dot human beings all through the natural world, and each one of them needs a lawn and they need a backyard and they need a car to get around, then it's very inefficient. And there is a tension between what feels environmentally alive, being at the eco resort, and what is environmentally sustainable, which is living in the gray building.
Yeah, I remember getting deep in the weeds about some of these urban carbon emissions, and I think it was like 6 stories was the general consensus that was the ideal height to build, and that level of density was the most carbon efficient.
That seems plausible. I didn't know that, but that's an interesting...
I won't remember the citation. It's a Jacobin piece from forever ago.
They have a good, I think, orientation on these things, Jacobin.
I take a lot of inspiration from them. Yeah, Jen Pan is a good friend. She'll be on the podcast in a few weeks from now. You mentioned the Infrastructure Act. One of the things that I find especially interesting about this book, you mentioned in the end Gary Gerstl's work on political orders. Maybe I take some of this internet stuff too seriously. I think many people don't take it seriously enough.
That is fair too. That is why I read your work.
We are That's
So
well, you know
what balance of the fringe to take on?
If you told me that a
difficult.
blogger monarchist would have a direct line to the administration, I would have disagreed with you in 2010, but here we are.
Yes, here we are.
We are on the threshold of some kind of thing changing. The way that Gerstle frames this, that you summarize in the book, is that there was this period of New Deal liberalism, 1930 to 70, and then neoliberalism, 1970 to, I think you cut it off around 2010.
Yeah, the financial crisis.
The Infrastructure Act, I feel like I mention this every episode, but the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Act are so uncharacteristic of the past 40 years of American policy. I feel like this is lost on people. Would you speak to the significance of some of this Biden legislation?
I sort of go in my own head back and forth on this. I think a lot of people who are important ideological entrepreneurs and are people I'm friends with, want to overstate how big of a break this is. I don't think the neoliberal era was ever, I mean, it's not like we didn't do big infrastructure bills. The Infrastructure Act definitely, to me, was not a big break. We built a lot of infrastructure in this period. We had a lot of big infrastructure bills. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was funding many of the same things that the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and to some degree, even the IRA was funding. So this thing where it's like Obama's super neoliberal and Joe Biden, it's not, there are breaks. Lena Khan is a break, for instance, in antitrust enforcement. And we do move away from, but this is much more of a political retreat than I think a new ideological consensus. We do move away from pricing carbon as the frontline strategy after the cap and trade bill fails to subsidizing technology and infrastructure as a frontline strategy because that's a better politics. So I think that's true. I do think it's true, though, the place where it is a break and evolution of something is that industrial policy comes back into vogue. I think so explicitly saying that for reasons primarily, though not only, of national security, we have to recapture huge supply and innovation chains.
Yes.
That's a bit newer. And that, I think, fundamentally reflects the lessons of China and the fear of our industrial dependence on China.
Yes.
I've heard this called, what is it? Green national security Keynesianism. There's some good line for
Green national security Keynesianism?
Yeah.
That's okay.
It's something like that.
Good.
There's a better line than that one that I wish I had.
I collect these long tail ideologies, so I appreciate it.
I do think China is a huge and almost sort of overwhelming shadow force on our politics. Lately, not such a shadow. Yeah. But I think even if you go back to the Obama era, it was already there. You already had people who would constantly be saying, oh, well, we're sitting here dithering in the US Senate. Look at what China is building, right? Yeah. The envy of what China was building, that they could build and we couldn't. And then I think losing so much manufacturing prowess and frontier innovation to them, right? Recognizing that they were not just low on the value chain anymore, but they were capable of doing things in battery storage and in semiconductors and so on that were beginning to threaten us. In some cases, they were more capable of doing complex manufacturing than we were or are, because we've just lost too much of the know-how and the sort of embedded and embodied ecosystems of technology and professional competence. And I think second, the experience of watching Russia weaponize Europe's dependence on its natural gas. Right. That was the next point, I think, where people realized, and I think actually at around the same time, the harsh lesson of the pandemic of if you lose semiconductor access, your entire economy is going to go to shit, right? Because semiconductors became scarce for more complicated reasons than national security, but nevertheless. And so I do think there's a series of pressures that have pushed Americans to realize that they need to build, they need to manufacture, they need to invent. And there are things that you need to keep here because, or at least keep in close alliance, with countries that you're really sure you have both an alliance with and access to in a way that we're not sure we'll always have access to Taiwanese semiconductor foundries because you could lose it. Particularly as we sort of seem to be back in this era of great power competition.
Yeah, we're all, I think, hesitant to say that neoliberalism is over. That's a big claim to make. No one wants to jump out in front of that one. But we are in some different type of a period. We're at least on the cusp of this new thing. You write, as in the 1930s and again in the 1970s, external threats and internal crises are converging and making possible a new kind of politics. What are the defining characteristics of this period? How could we start to circle around a term or a definition for this model that we're moving towards?
You mean abundance politics?
Well, I think abundance is the proposal, but there may be a variety of interpretations. There's a retreat from globalization. There's a, interventionist hand in the economy. There's increased national security, multipolar competition, era of superpowers. How should we understand this new period?
I don't think we can understand it yet. I think we can see competing ideas. I think right now we are speaking at the dawn of the second Trump era.
Right.
And there are a lot of ideological tendencies that feel extraordinarily strong right now. I wonder what they will be like in 4 years. Like you mentioned, a retreat from globalization. I'm not sure about that. I think that we have retreated. When people talk about neoliberalism, they talk about a lot of different things. You had Quinn Slobodian on here. He's obviously got some great books on this. And he has a more specific and complex definition that I think is more historically accurate, right? That it has to do with, people who are using, outsourcing democracy or sort of overwhelming democracy to protect an international market approach. There's a lot to be said for it. I think there's a common usage of neoliberalism. What are we really talking about when we talk about the ways in which there's continuity between Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama?
Right.
And what are we talking about culturally at that same time? Because there is not continuity between them on taxes. I think people get very simplistic about this in a way that is not at all backed up. Like if you want to tell me that Barack Obama and Paul Ryan were part of the same political movement, you really have to describe how. The way in which I think they were, right? The thing that I think neoliberalism correctly describes, which is not gone and is not going to completely go away, but I think is getting rebalanced in the collective ideological imagination, is the potency of market logic. The sense that the right way to reason together fundamentally is the market. That prices are giving us the right information.
Right.
The tendency to not really see the ways we're always intervening in the market and shaping and creating them. The ways in which, as people grew up in school, like the idea of just a humanistic education fell away and everything was about how you could invest in yourself as an individual piece of capital to have the highest asset price when you went out onto the job market later. You even got really weird ideas during this period, like, oh, you should have ways for people to, instead of student loans, maybe people invest in your future and they get 5% of the returns, right? That was, to me, apex neoliberal logic.
Yeah.
And the sense that a lot is missed by market logic, that a lot is missed in terms of what unchecked capitalism will do to communities, what it will do to the earth, what it will do to human happiness, what it will do to families. The sense that that logic needs to be countered, that it needs to be, that you need, in a term I love from John Kenneth Galbraith, you need countervailing forces. I think that is what is changing. So it's not that we don't think about markets or trust markets or take markets seriously, we do. But I think there's much more bone deep recognition that markets do not know if you are getting rich, and they do not care if you are getting rich because you are burning coal or you are building solar panels. Like markets will happily destroy the earth if you don't orient them, if you don't use them as a tool. They will destroy communities if you don't use them as a tool. And so the question of what other logics emerge is an important one. And the role of government then becomes very important. One thing my friend Matt Iglesias has made this point as well, building off of something Francis Fukuyama says, which is that neoliberalism was not the elevation of the market, it was the denigration of the state. And I do think there's something to that. And one of the threads I'm trying to pull out in the book is of a state skeptical left that was very powerful, remains very powerful in the back half of the 20th century and into the 21st. That we think about the fundamental cleavage in government as between the left that likes big government and the right that doesn't like big government. You dig a little bit deeper, you look at how blue states actually run, you look at how the government actually runs. And in fact, like you do have a right that criticizes, dislikes, often kind of tries to starve parts of government, but you have a left that hobbles it, that is frightened of its power, of its capture, that wants to contain it with procedure, slowing it down by voice, by analysis. And so there was a deep discomfort with allowing the government to act, giving the government the power to act. And I do think something we're moving towards now, and this is certainly core to abundance politics, is recognizing it sounds so fucking obvious Some things you're just like saying something like, yes, it is that simple. The government is neither the problem nor the solution. It is sometimes a problem, it is sometimes a solution. It needs to get out of the way so people can build market rate housing. It needs to get into the game so we build enough clean energy. It could do more to get into the game to incentivize modular housing, right? There's a lot of things you can do, but sometimes what you need, in my view, to be focused on is what are you trying to achieve? And then work backwards to what is bottlenecking it. Sometimes you need the government to pull forward technologies by creating things like advanced market commitments. At the same time, maybe you need them to get out of the way of those technologies by making the regulatory pathway those technologies need to traverse much smoother. That's more or less what happened with Operation Warp Speed.
I was just going to mention, yeah.
So that, to me, is sort of where we're moving. You know, I think you could be a little glib about it and say, we went through thesis with the New Deal era, antithesis with the neoliberal Reagan era, and what we need now is synthesis between the sort of extreme pro-growth, pro-government, there's kind of nothing standing in the way. Then the more extreme, government is the problem, not the solution. Government cannot tell us our values, tell us our ideals. The scariest words from the gut are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And now we need something like a little bit wiser and not so tilted towards one side or the other. That's not so much about government. It's about what are we trying to achieve and what do we need to do to get there. It's not, by the way, non-ideological, because then the fight, which is a profound fight, is over what are you trying to achieve, right? What is your vision of a good life? What is your vision of a just society? Sometimes people think that what I'm offering here is a simple technocratic push towards doing more stuff. But it's not, right? There are particular things I want us to do, and then there are things I would like us to do less of. I don't want to make it easier to build new coal plants. I want to make it functionally impossible, right? So you actually have to be connected to what you're trying to accomplish, and then you ask the questions from there.
I guess one of the things that I'm observing now is that this idea that the left was pro-big government and the right was small government, there seems to be an inversion of that, at least rhetorically, with the rise of the America First constituency. There's this rise of the new right. I think this is in many ways a product of the failures of the left to look after people's material well-being. We have things that are flanking the right and left of neoliberalism, but we're kind of straddling this indeterminate period.
One thing I really like about Gary Gerstl's work is that I think he correctly places foreign policy and competition with other great powers at the center of at least ideological shifts in the American system.
Right.
So he really puts the threat of communism at the center of the solidification of the New Deal order.
Yes.
And I think he correctly puts the fall of communism at the center of the domination of market logic in the neoliberal order. And a lot of that, to me, doesn't cement. I mean, in terms of the theory of orders, right? The neoliberal order does not cement until Bill Clinton agrees to it. But that happens, that has a lot to do with what market democracies look like in the sort of nice interregnum right after the Soviet Union falls and before, to go back to our friend Fukuyama, history restarts again.
Right.
And then I think it's a sort of just natural thing of systems, that any system running for too long is going to require correction. And when you look at problems that America, but also other countries were facing by the 70s, strong government for an extended period of time, it becomes sclerotic. And it's Carter who kicks off the deregulatory era in American politics, not Ronald Reagan. And, deregulates telecommunications and transportation and beer, among other things. And so we have our craft beer explosion, some decades later. And that's responding, I mean, in part to inflation, but also in part to the reality that things need to push back and forth. And I think that's one of my theories of all this, is that there is an almost hydraulic nature to ideological eras and turns. Always the solutions of the last era become the problems of the next, because you leave any solution in place too long. And one, it becomes a mismatch, but also in one of the dynamics I describe in the book that, is sort of the famous Mansur-Olson view of affluent societies, that any stable system, particularly any stable democratic system over time, will develop a lot of internal bargaining, negotiation, crust, process, regulation, re-regulation, and will need disruption. And maybe that disruption will be in a market-oriented direction, But when the markets overgrow, as they did by the time we hit the financial crisis,
Right.
it'll be in a government-oriented direction. Sometimes we're just living through the reality that if you let things go on too long, you're going to have to correct them. Everybody wants an ideological explanation that says they're going to be right in the end. A very important part of my politics is there is no the end. You're at best going to be right for a while. And then the question is, do you realize when that while is over?
How did you first become politicized? What were your politics as like a teenager?
I read Chomsky as a teenager.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, of
okay.
course.
How'd you come across that?
My brother gave it to me.
Okay.
But I also grew up, I started reading Chomsky like after, I think my first political book, or one of them, was Chomsky's 9/11, right? And one thing that politicized me as a teenager was 9/11. Like all of a sudden, politics was happening all around me. And as one of my history professors in college said, you can feel history tightening its fist. I always love that line. You may or may not have been interested in politics then, but it was interested in you. Things were happening.
Yeah.
And so the need to begin to develop some sense of why and what felt very present.
Were you involved in activism as a young person? Did you protest the war, or like what was your kind of first political engagement?
I was involved in a bunch of activism, but more on the labor side. So I was like, I was very interested in state politics.
Yeah.
As I got into politics, what I was interested in initially was state politics. And I wanted to be political in California, and I would go to farm workers' marches and things like that. Then I started working on campaigns. And I thought what I'd do is become a staffer. And I ended up interning on the Howard Dean campaign.
I remember this, yeah.
And hated working on campaigns. And began to realize pretty quickly that the thing I liked doing was writing about and thinking about politics. And I didn't want to be yoked to anyone else's interpretation of what was true or what was right or what should be done, be that an organization or an individual.
Yeah.
And so my future was not going to be as a staffer or a campaign hack or something like that, but it was going to be, I wasn't intending this, but I was an early blogger, and I never thought about that as a profession. It wasn't when I started doing it. And then somebody became clear, like, oh, you can actually take this into journalism. That's what I did.
Yeah, I think of actually your background as a blogger as being an integral part of your analysis. So, and maybe this, you don't hear this all the time, but my background is in media theory. These are the things I care about. Hearing you talk about Vox, hearing you talk about alternative media, I think now that a lot of our kind of attentional politics, for lack of a better term, are led by phenomena of media theory. That there are people who have tremendous influence that can mobilize people to get out and vote, protest, whatever it happens to be, different calls to action. And so an analysis of media phenomena, understanding the unbundling cycle from legacy media into alternative media is actually really essential for looking at this widening Overton window of different voices. In a previous era, someone might have been gatekept from the National Review, for example. But today they can go out on Twitter or Substack, whatever, YouTube, anything like that, and they can publish whatever they want to however many people want to listen. And so part of this broadening of the Overton window at this very weird, pivotal, transitional time in actual political history is having this magnification effect on our political discourse and all of the ideas that are in the mix right now. Do you apply any of these early lessons from alt media to your analysis of politics?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of my core views in politics right now is that, so I'm a media theory nerd myself. And compared to most people in my profession, I'm just like always like shaking people by the lapel, being like, you need to read Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman. Like it's all there, or at least enough of it is there. And when I look at the last couple of years, I think a dynamic that is very under-discussed is that when we moved towards social media being the dominant form of attention capture, and social media also sets the agenda for much of the mainstream media, maybe a little bit less than it did 10 years ago, but still quite substantially. Social media selects for high engagement and high controversy. It doesn't select for everybody's more or less cool with this, right? The previous era in media selected for everybody's more or less cool with this. The broadcast networks didn't want to offend anybody. The newspapers wanted to keep their local advertising monopolies. If what you're really doing is selling advertisements to tell people that Macy's is having a shoe sale, what you need is for the maximum number of people to be willing to read your paper. So you don't want to offend them too much. It pushes towards a kind of broad, just the facts, ma'am, more milk toast, more both sides. You can take stands, but if you take such sharp stands that you lose a big part of the audience, then you can't have a local monopoly, almost by definition. Then you move into this sort of war against all for attention. And all of a sudden, what really matters isn't that everybody likes what you say. It's that enough people care strongly about what you say. And frankly, if a bunch of people care strongly in the opposite direction, they think you fucking suck, all the better. Because that's more engagement. And so you have this, and I think we're living through it right now. I think it is pretty clear that what you have now are extraordinarily strong cycles of a structure of social political thought, ideology. They come really fast, right? Anything from at a low level, like I remember a couple years ago when all of a sudden we were talking about tankies. And it was like, are we really going to take this seriously? And in the end, I think you don't have to take it that seriously. But they were out there, right? And they would have gotten zero attention.
They're still out there.
Before that. You would know for your sins. All the way to really, really sharp, like things that affected all of society all at once. Like this rapidity of the rise of BLM, of the Me Too movement, to some degree of then the alt-right and the new right backlash to that. I think there's a dynamic where things rise just very, very fast, but then the exact same mechanism, that selection for the new idea that is highly engaging, creates a selection mechanism for its opposite. And so then the backlash also comes very, very, very quickly, right? We have moved from, within an unbelievably compressed period of time through the Black Lives Matter, like attaining a level of power and centrality that I think nobody would have expected right at the beginning of that, to a level of backlash that is, all the way to the other side, right? We're in a we're in a worse place on that level than we were during Barack Obama, right?
Nelly, who does the camera here, was telling us this story. Sorry, I'm breaking the fourth wall, but Nelly was telling us this fucking hilarious story that there's a hedge fund that was removing the word diversity from its pitch decks in reference to like diversifying your portfolio. Just because they don't want the word to show up.
Right, you don't want to be.
That's an incredible overcorrection.
Incredible. So, I mean, you go from Me Too to Pete Hegseth, but it goes the other way too. I mean, you went from Trump, right? Like Trump won, to like the real intense period of BLM and Me Too within a couple of years, right? And so, right, recently we've had a real like incredible empowering of Trumpist vibes. And it seems like everything's different. The guy won 49.8% of the popular vote, and now like America will. I mean, it might never be the same, but there is a sense of like incredible cultural rout. My sense is that within a couple of years, you're going to have another counterforce emerge. It may not be the same pendulum it was like this time. Bernie Sanders and the rise of Red Rose Twitter were a very similar dynamic. You would not have had that kind of socialist tendency have that kind of potency in the Democratic Party as quickly as it did in an earlier era. But also very, very, very quickly, the squad went from like the future of Democratic Party politics to, except for AOC, who is herself an extraordinarily talented politician, feeling like a quite spent force, right? And you don't get the sense that in 2020, I think Democrats felt that either a very strong identity politics or a very strong democratic socialism was what was going to come right after Joe Biden. And it isn't what came right after Joe Biden. In fact, Kamala Harris ran back towards a more pragmatic, almost like Obama-esque, trying to at least do almost a more Biden-esque politics. So I don't think you can separate this sort of rhythm of ideological eruption, dominance, deflation that we're in right now from the media. One of the things I've been thinking about, I think people actually get this wrong about their own movements, it is good to be able to command attention, and it is almost equally as bad to be able to command attention. What harmed Democrats in 2024 wasn't Elon Musk's ownership of Twitter in 2024. It was their dominance of Twitter in 2020. And they were paying, in things like the they them ad for things they convinced themselves of.
Right.
When they had much more power and no brakes on the kind of hardcore ideological in-group policing dynamic that social media creates. And now I think you're seeing the same thing. It's going to happen with the Trump folks. It's not good for them, I think, that Musk has that much power with Twitter and they're all there. But we're early in the Trump era. Elon Musk gave a couple of his young lieutenants access to the Treasury payment system.
Right.
The judge froze that at 2 people. Then one of the people a couple hours later had to resign because it turned out he had an incredibly racist Twitter account where he said things like,
shocked.
I was
Really?
racist before it was cool. But then within a couple hours after that, you had Musk saying, or a day or two after that, saying, maybe should we reinstate this guy? And JD Vance comes in on Twitter, who clearly wants to be allied with Musk and says, nobody should lose their job over social media if the guy does a bad job. So maybe he'll get put back in. It's probably, though, not a great thing for a movement to be working off of a series of online incentives that might get you to put, whatever he is, 20-something who's incredibly racist back inside the Treasury payment system.
Right.
When that wasn't a popular thing to do in the first place. Like, there's no incentive in a way to stop and fucking think for a second and take into account the feelings of people who don't think exactly like you do and who aren't either clapping for you or hurling epithets at you.
On this topic of Twitter, there's something of a competitive arms race for the hottest take that you can imagine.
Yeah, I call Twitter a gain of function. It's gain of function research for takes.
Yeah, it's very much so.
How can it's like you're just altering the take again and again until it goes viral, and then even more until it escapes the lab and destroys your career and maybe everybody else. Just like, what can we do with this thing?
So given this kind of attentional economy, the incentives to comedically exaggerate your ideas in many cases, how do you interpret this landscape? How do you tell when someone's making a joke or they mean it for real? Or when someone makes a joke to conceal their actual political beliefs? How do you parse this kind of comedy?
I don't think you can tell
dynamic?
because I also don't think people know.
They often don't know. Well, that's my apex when I ask people this question, that people don't actually know their own politics. But okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the number of people who think they're joking and are not is very, very high. And simultaneously, I have so many times had the experience. I'm mostly not on Twitter and I'm not currently on Twitter. In part because I think it both makes me stupider and it makes me dislike other people too much.
Yeah.
Right? It makes them present to me in a way where I think of them as flattened. And look, you have had plenty of people on the show who, if the only version of them I knew was Twitter, I wouldn't give them the time of day. But they're much more complex thinkers when they have to sit down with somebody and the hydraulics of human interaction take over.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that's not real either. I've many times had incredibly reasonable, positive sum interactions with hardcore conservatives who, when it comes down to the vote, do not in any way act in a way that reflects the many thoughtful concerns and complexities that they revealed to me in our private conversation. So, people are different in different contexts. We are contextual creatures. We contain multitudes, but it's not just what we contain. We are always in interaction with the rules of the game that we're playing at that given moment. Who I am here is different than who I am on Twitter, is different than who I am if you made me a congressman and I had to, raise money and take votes.
Right.
And so I think it's worth not believing too much stability. You have to give people room for complexity, but also not be overly fooled by complexity, if that makes sense. If Elon Musk and I hung out, and I think we probably have a lot to talk about and agree on. I've been in rooms with him before when he was a different person, right? I found him very interesting to talk to. But in the game he's actually playing right now, which is a game for influence in the MAGA coalition and closeness to Donald Trump, who he is in that room with me isn't meaningful, even though it might actually be a real part of him.
There's this emerging coalition of the new right. There's many different tensions in there. There's Musk on, let's say, the tech right, and then there's a nationalist right. The H-1B visa dispute, for example. Who do you think is going to win of these competing coalitions?
I don't think they're typically going to be competing.
Hmm.
I think there are relatively few issues, at least early on, that are going to split them. I don't think there's only going to be one winner because Donald Trump is liquid.
How do you mean?
He's fluid. His preferences change. So the fact that he chose...
I thought you were talking about his meme coins for a second.
That too. Although that's probably not very liquid, come to think of it. It's very, if you sell them all, the price is going to crash. He'll choose one side one day and the next side the other day. He's not a stable ideological figure. This is court politics. What mood is the king in? And so they're all going to orient towards him and what they think he wants. They are not going to abandon the coalition just because they don't get what they want, right? Did the Nationals leave after the tax cuts in the first term? They didn't. The tech right has either accepted or slowly convinced itself of things on immigration that it definitely did not believe a couple of years ago, and doesn't believe in the way it acts right now. The question of nationalism is a contested question. Musk and Andreessen and these figures are nationalists too. The fight over whether or not H-1B visas make the nation stronger is a fight between different kinds of nationalists. So Trump is going to cut people loose when they are no longer useful to him. But the other thing that's just simply true about this coalition is it's fundamentally a personality cult, and it will do what Trump tells it to do. So, I don't think about it as a thing that is ideological fractures that really will break it apart. I think Musk will be pushed outside at some point, but he'll be pushed outside because he's become a liability. And then he'll be like Steve Bannon, like an influencer on the outside, right? That's my sense of how this works. But it's all about Trump giving people the nod, telling somebody else to get somebody he doesn't like out, moving with opinion the way he feels like moving with opinion.
Yeah. Of these emerging currents on the right, they will often make an argument that the American innovation ecosystem, which is something you write about in the book, something I care about a lot, science and technology in the United States, that we had such incredible prosperity in the post-war period, that the American system was essentially sloppily designed. That if you look at countries that came into prosperity later, they have more competent innovation ecosystems. In the US, we hand out all this money to the private sector. We try to tax it back. It leaks out through capital flight. And in other countries, they, in some cases, own a stake in those companies that they invest in. They get profits back. You mention Mariana Mazzucato in the book, someone whose work I admire very much. How do you view the construction of the American innovation ecosystem? What is wrong with it that needs to be changed?
I don't think there's any one thing. I think in the book, and Derek Thompson, my co-author, did a huge amount of the work on this. I do think there's a symmetry between the way bureaucracy and process attains a momentum of its own in politics and the way it's done that in scientific research and innovation. I think the evidence is overwhelming that the NIH, scientists spend, who are getting these kinds of grants, about 40% of the year writing grants. Derek has a nice line on this where he's like, imagine all the scientists got like a chronic fatigue disease that reduced their efficacy, their productivity every year by 40%. We imagine that was like a bioweapon the Chinese unleashed on us. We'd be upset. Instead, we've let it happen. And not only that, but it's not just at the time, but it pushes towards consensus science. It pushes towards things reviewers are already sure will work out. And so, that's one dimension of what's difficult about the innovation ecosystem at the basic scientific and R&D level. And then you have the loss of manufacturing. And you learn things in the making of things. The way Taiwan became dominant in chips isn't that one day Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation began making the most advanced chips in the world. It's that they started by making some of the least advanced chips in the world, or at least the middling advanced chips in the world. But then, because they were focusing on the cost of production, they just began climbing up the value chain. till now they're able to do things that by and large we can't. Same is true for China. There's a part in the book early on that's about cities.
Yeah.
And the sort of gating, understanding cities as like the true frontier of the American economy. The frontier isn't land, the frontier is ideas. And cities are where ideas primarily come from. And one of the things I talk about in that section is the way it's incredibly hard to replicate agglomeration effects. You can't cities what they offer is not a dumb gift of density. There is not one significant AI startup in New York City. Silicon Valley just dominates AI. It's like, however many square miles, but in the tens. On the other hand, finance is incredibly potent here. Where New York does incredibly well in terms of computer engineering is when it serves finance. And lots of places would like to steal that from New York, but they can't. Just like New York is not able to steal tech from San Francisco.
Right.
There is something very fragile about the kinds of agglomeration effects that create innovative professional ecosystems. And they're very hard to just pick up and move somewhere else. And they take time to get going. And the Soviet Union certainly tried to make many of them out of thin air. China's been able to make a number of them, but not through necessarily, like a lot of their efforts have failed too. I think you need to treat the ones you have as incredibly precious and recognize that when you lose things, because you've let it become so much cheaper somewhere else that it just doesn't make sense to be where you are anymore, that you lose something that you may not really be able to get back. What we're trying to do now is rebuild a semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem, not a semiconductor manufacturing fab or plant or company, but in the long run, an ecosystem of talent and expertise and conversation and competition. And that's very, very, very hard to do. And we have no idea if we're going to succeed at doing it. So yeah, I think there's been a sort of bureaucratization at the scientific level, and then a kind of carelessness, an undervaluing of the innovative importance of manufacturing, of making things, of these ecosystems at the production level.
I was surprised in the conclusion that you're making reference to Marx and Engels. It made me wonder if there's a certain country that exists now that you would like the American economy to resemble more. Is there like a actually existing example we could point to for abundance politics?
Not one off the top of my head, and certainly not one animating the book. One of the critiques I make in the book, and Derek and I make in the book, is of a left that too often is patterning itself off of Northern Europe. That I think often, what is the left trying to do? It's trying to get to the social safety net of Denmark.
Yeah.
Right? If we could just have what France has, we'd be fine. But no, I don't think there is the kind of forward-looking supply and production powerhouse, that I'm talking about, married to some of the political values that I hold. In many ways, what I want us to do is get away from thinking, well, if we could only get somewhere that some country already is, that would be great. We want to get somewhere that nobody is, that nobody has been, in terms of the technologies on access to us, in terms of the abundance on access to us. Like, we want to be in the future, and we want the future to be different than the past. One of the riffs I'm sort of proud of in the book is about the metaphor of growth as a pie. We're always saying, the problem is, you don't want to just slice a pie, you want to grow the pie. Well, you don't fucking grow pies. That's not how pies work. But also, if you did grow a pie, what you would get is more pie. But the thing about growth is it's change. The more growth you have, like we talk about in these anodyne ways, like 2 percentage points of growth, 3 percentage points, 4 percentage points, right? It seems like not that big. Compounded over years and decades, what you are then measuring is the complete transformation of societies into something different. And the thing that excites me isn't that we can look like France. France is fine. There are ways in which I would like our social services to look more like France. But European productivity has looked terrible in recent years, right? They're not the model that I think we should be looking for. And in terms of the world I want, for my children, the world I want for me, I want energy abundance in a way nobody currently has it. I want to see cures that we don't currently have. I would like AI to be great for humanity rather than terrible for humanity, and nobody knows if we can quite get there. I want to see California have, incredible mass transit whistling across the state. I want to see us flying in supersonic jets. And yeah, I want us to have enough homes. One thing that is true is that in most of the big countries, the advanced democracies, and certainly in the Anglophone world, you have terrible housing crises across them. This isn't necessary. In many ways, like, the point of the book is that you want a progressivism, a liberalism that is built on change, that is built on trying to get to somewhere that we haven't yet been.
Abundance, I think March 18th, it'll be out.
I think that's right.
Something like that. Yeah. All right. Ezra, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.